I would like to take this opportunity to number one, welcome everyone. And number two, thank the sponsors for today's shiur. Our shiur on Parashat Vayigash is sponsored by Stephen Leah Roth, Usher and Barbara Frankel, Yochanan and Sheba Sanders. To commemorate the yahrzeit of Stephen Barbara's father, Leon Roth, Yehuda Aryeh, Ben Yisrael Yoel, Zechrona Livrocha, Neshama Shavan Aliyah, and Sheba and Asher's father, Rabbi Dr. Israel Frankel, Rav Yisrael Aryeh, Ben Rav Osher Yishayo, Zechrona Livrocha. So we do thank you. Neshama should have in Aliyah. We also want to take this opportunity to thank our other sponsor, Ruth and David Zimmerman, to commemorate the recent yahrzeits of Ruth's parents, Sarah Miriam Bat Binyamin Cohen, Zechrona Livracha, and Yosef ben Avram Abba, Zechrona Livracha, as well as the recent wedding, in honor of the recent wedding of their granddaughter, Sarah Miriam Zimmerman, to Shlomo Bleich. Nachas and Mazel Tov, and may we celebrate good things for many years to come in good health, and also may the neshamas benefit from our gathering here today in a positive gathering for the sake of studying some Torah and appreciating the depths of the words of our Creator. We are studying today Parashat Vayigash. What happens in Parashat Vayigash? So the truth is, it's a good news parsha, because the people of Israel come together. Right? You hear that? The people of Israel come together. Unity between Yosef and his brothers is something to celebrate. The Haftorah focuses on this idea that in the Messianic era, there's going to be this blending of the trees of Yosef and Yehuda. So the roots for that concept appear in this week's parsha. Now, if you're going to ask yourself, wait a second, what does that mean that in the Messianic era, the tribe of Yosef and Yehuda are going to come together? And that's what appears. Tune into the Haftorah. It comes from the book of Yecheskel, and Yecheskel performs an act that symbolizes this idea, right? I'm going to take the Etz Yosef and I'm going to take the Etz Yehuda. I'm going to go ahead and take the tree of Judah and I'm going to take the tree of Joseph and blend them together. They will turn into an Etz Echad. What does that mean today? I don't see major fights today between Judah and Yosef. I do see fights perhaps between different groups, different ideologies. But what does this vision relate to as we look at society today? So perhaps you could look at Yehuda and you could look at Yosef, and you understand that there are two different approaches here. There's the Yehuda that views the tradition as one that relates to the family. Yehuda is not involved in taking care of the welfare of society. He's not a world leader. He focuses on guiding his people, guiding his family. The family turn to him. It's the ones within the Jewish community that focus on internal needs. Yosef, on the other hand, extremely devoted to the principles of our faith, to the traditions that he received, remain committed despite temptation and challenge. But Yosef is involved in addressing issues of the world. The world has problems that need to be addressed. Then it was a famine. Today, perhaps it relates to the idea that, yes, we are Jewish, but we are part of humanity. And if we can make a contribution to the world while retaining our faith, that too is part of Judaism, okay? And if we could tap into the wisdom of the nations of the world and as a result interact with them, because if I tune in to the words of the philosophers, of non-Jewish thinkers, and if Immanuel Kant talks to me and I could utilize that for my own self-growth, there's an interaction there. For some, that's unacceptable, right? It's not wisdom from within. It is not something that our tradition handed over from generation to generation. But for the Yosef philosophy, you interact. And when you interact, there's a give and a take. And I do see within the Jewish world today, a lot of Yehudos and a lot of Yosefs. People that see Judaism as one that has all the answers from within, and to go ahead and value wisdom of the world, or to be concerned deeply or actively for the welfare of the world, doesn't seem to be on their agenda, perhaps in the Messianic era, but they believe that you focus within. And obviously, there's a lot of room for improvement from within. Those are the Yehuda. Who exactly is the Yosef? Those that have an understanding of the philosophy of the world, of thinkers of the world, interact and understand that we have some level of responsibility of presenting Judaism to the world in a language they understand. You think about Rabbi Sir Jonathan Sachs, Olav Shalom, Zichrono Livrocha, and his ability to interact with world leaders and world thinkers. And he was able with great comfort to have conversations with them about Immanuel Kant and Jeremy Bentham and Kierkegaard and Sartre and Nietzsche and even Heidegger. So you think to yourself that this is quite incredible, because here you have a person that stuck to Jewish faith, valued Jewish education, valued what we are about, but like Yosef understands that, you know what, we interact with the world. The Jewish world that thinks that these are two different trees and two different entities, and we have to separate one from the other, is a problematic Jewish world. Because what we have to recognize is that, you know what, we're all one. Yes, just as a successful military can have a Navy and an Air Force and the Marines, and they all, in essence, are one team, so too, we have to realize that Yosef and Yehuda, these different approaches, are really on the same team. And if you're on the same team, you respect one another. If you ever watch football, there's offense and defense, right? They do very different things, but they're one team. They celebrate together. We too need to celebrate together. When are we going to merit that? Messianic era. That's the Haftorah. That's the celebration that Yecheskel has a vision that one day will occur. And it has roots in this week's Parsha when Yosef and Yehuda and the brothers come together. So that's why I consider this a very optimistic, positive Parsha. Now, there's some challenge here because, yes, our ancestors are making their way down to Egypt. And it's the beginning of an exile, a bitter exile, spiritually and physically. So we are mindful of it, but the Almighty promises Yaakov, you know what, I'll be with you. And one day we're going to leave. And we took from Egypt our identity. So overall, I would like to take this parsha as a very positive one. What I really want to focus on today are the activities of Yosef in Egypt. I mean, Yosef is running the country. Pharaoh is a figurehead, I would say, and obviously the authority among Yosef. But when it comes to daily activities, I envision Pharaoh's schedule as one that he wakes up very late. He has a big feast for breakfast. Afterwards, takes a stroll in a magnificent garden, relaxes in a spa, and perhaps for 10, 15 minutes will hear, or at least appear to be listening to some advisors about issues as he's enjoying their cigar and some champagne. That was Pharaoh's running the country. Yosef, on the other hand, it was far more than a 9-to-5 job. He was there bright and early from sunrise to sunset, working hard, figuring out how to sustain Egypt, how to assist them through challenge, and how to be sure that the nation survives this terrible famine. He's running the country hands-on. And he does a lot of different things. And the Torah decides that it is important for us, the reader, to be aware of it and to learn from it, okay? So he has these activities that he, in essence, buys all the land of Egypt. he also transports communities from one region to another. So there's mass migration taking place, mass migration, where families are moved to one end of Egypt, other ones are moved to the other end. Some major movements are occurring, and what we wonder as we read, why is Yosef doing this? What is he trying to achieve? And there are two approaches that are presented by the commentators. There are those that say that Yosef walked into Egypt with an understanding that this is a corrupt society, and we have to go through a process of deconstruction and reconstruction to create an ethical society. My father would note that if you remember the first dream of Pharaoh that related to fat cows, and the term fat cows appears in the book of Amos as a description of corrupt rulers that are only concerned about themselves, how to fatten themselves. And this was an issue that plagued Egypt, that there were regional politicians that were simply only concerned about their own welfare. And what Yosef explains to Pharaoh is that in your dream, before you have a problem or before you want to address the issue of grain, that is going to be a very significant issue during the years of famine and the years when you are supposed to prepare for that famine, be aware of the fact that there's a problem that needs to be addressed first. And that is the corrupt rulers. If you don't take care of it, if you have a country that is run with complete corruption and no concern for the masses, it does not make a difference how much you have. People are going to starve. You think about countries in Africa that have a tremendous amount of natural resources, from diamonds to silver, and you read about what they have there. And at the same time, there are villages where people do not have fresh running water. And you have a population that less than 3% receive vaccines. And it is not a problem that they don't have resources. The problem is corruption. Corruption is the issue. And this is what Yosef, a person, a human being that understands that if I can make a contribution to a civilization, to society, it is my responsibility to do so. He communicates with Pharaoh. We have a problem here. You have corrupt rulers. We need to address them. Give me control, and I'm going to run this country in a righteous way. Okay, so therefore, the moving people from area to area was to strengthen the hold of government, right? There's always this question we ask, what philosophy should we have towards government, right? Do we need this big monster Leviathan government, as Hobbes would say, because people are brutal and people are not to be trusted? Or perhaps we want to limit government, right? You want to follow philosophers like Locke who believe you have to limit government because people, in essence, have freedoms and trust the people. And these are two, social contract political theory debates. Yosef felt that what Egypt needed at that time was a strong and just government. And therefore, he was obviously the just component and ran the country with honesty. That was obviously a big Kiddush Hashem. He represents the values of Abraham and used them, that everything in the country was basically for the people. I don't know if it was by the people, but obviously for the people. And on the other hand, if you're gonna not address this issue, society would fall apart. So bottom line, approach number one for Yosef's desire to uproot people from region to region was to strengthen the government, because if you don't have people in their ancestral land, they have less of an attachment. And perhaps you could go ahead and guide them. When you have a person moving into a community, you could guide them with the new policies of the community. And it could be demanding policies of righteousness, of honesty, of a judicial system that functions. It was done for the sake of Egypt. That's approach number one. Yosef does it because if you have the ability to make a difference in a society, it's your responsibility. And Yosef felt, this is my responsibility. Approach number two is that Yosef understands very well that the tradition they had in their family, that Yosef received from Yaakov, and Yaakov from Yitzchak, and Yitzchak from Avram, that one day the descendants of Avram Avinu, the ones that are designated and destined to be a light upon the nations, are going to go through a difficult exile in a foreign land. Yosef understood that that foreign land is Egypt. And now, as he sees his family coming down, and he realizes that difficult years are ahead, he's going to try to minimize the challenge to his family. And therefore, as outsiders, they're always going to be viewed as ones that are second-class citizens. They're going to be mistreated. If, on the other hand, you uproot all of the nation and everyone is adjusting to a new environment, no one could claim that I've been here for centuries because they're, immigrants to that new region. It will create a much easier situation for his family. So approach number 2 is that it was done for the Jewish people. And the truth is, you can bring the two together, because when a Jew, in an honest way, takes care of the needs of humanity, he does a Kiddush Hashem, he sanctifies the name of God, and that is good for the Jews. And so too, when a person is concerned about the Jewish people, that the Jewish people should be in a state that they can make a contribution. They can be educated, they can be happy, they can be healthy. In the long run, by the way, the whole world benefits, because we deep down believe Jews are good for the world. We've made contributions. We make physical contributions, that the list is very, very long of our contributions. We as Torah Jews believe that we make spiritual contributions because our commitment to these teachings that were given by the higher being gives value and reason for existence, and that is good for the world. So what is good for the Jew is good for the world. And what's good for the world, when done appropriately and with an understanding that I'm doing it because I'm an ethical being, that is also good for the Jewish people. So those are themes that appear in this week's parsha, but I want to focus tonight on a detail, on a very specific detail. And it appears in chapter 47 of Bereshit. It's towards the end of Vayigash. It's verse 19, 20, and 23. And the verse talks about the Egyptians communicating with Yosef regarding their state. They're desperate. They're completely desperate. So the Torah tells us, listen, year 2 has passed. We have no more money left. The the population of Egypt turns to their ruler Yosef. And therefore they ask in verse 19, Yosef, Lama namut, why should we die? There's a famine. You are controlling, right, thousands of tons of grain. Why should we die? And therefore, what they recommend is that for survival, kene otanu. Egyptians turn to Yosef, acquire us. We'll be yours. You'll own us. The country will own you. The government, Pharaoh, will own all of the population of Egypt. Big slave owner. Ve'et admotenu belechem, and so to acquire our lands and give us bread. So comes verse 20, and Yosef has to make a decision what to do. So in verse 20, we're told, Vayiken Yosef et kol admat Mitzrayim leFaro. He actually acquires all of the land. And the land belonged to Pharaoh. Vatehi haaretz leFaro. So verse 20 tells us who becomes the official owner of all land in Egypt? Pharaoh. Okay? Now, if you go forward to verse 23, Yosef communicates the new reality to the Egyptians. Vayomer Yosef elam. Yosef tells the nation, Hen kaniti etchem hayom. I have acquired you today. Ve'et admatchem leFaro, and your land to Pharaoh. And therefore, I'm giving you seed and you should live off what I provide. Okay? So there's a discussion here, a purchase that's made, verse 19, 20, and 23. Why is this information important? So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and share two divrei Torah from one of the greatest early 20th century thinkers and rabbinic figures, Rabbi Meir Simcha of Dvinsk, the Mesha Chochma, share two of his insights into these verses. And then I'm going to share with you a problem my father had with these two explanations and my father's insight, which I believe there's a lot to learn from that insight. I think it's appropriate to share it. I have Yortzeit, the 29th Yortzeit for my father, Olav Shalom de Shabbos. So therefore, I think it's appropriate for Parashat Vayigash to share something that I know from my father's notes. So are we ready? Two divrei Torah, contradiction in my father's opinion, and how he solves it. So number one, so let's start with Dvar Torah number one. And the question is, what's the benefit of the Torah telling us in verse 23 that Yosef acquires the Egyptian, hen kaniti etchem hayom ve'et admatchem? What's the benefit of this information being recorded in this text? That's the question Rameir Simcha asks. And he responds as follows. You know, the Jewish people had to deal with a significant lawsuit about their plunder, about the fact that they cleared Egypt out of all valuables as they departed. Were you aware of it? That there was a major lawsuit by the Egyptians towards the people of Israel, requesting back our silver and our gold, the silver and gold that the Israelites took as they left Egypt. And the Talmud shares with us a story that the Egyptians approached King Alexander the Great for judgment. Jews left, tremendous wealth. It's in the books, by the way. We can't deny it. And the Egyptians claimed that this is not right. Interesting. So the rabbis are not sure what to do. Who is going to represent the people of Israel on this issue? So there's a volunteer, not the greatest scholar, but that's why he volunteers, because his claim was that even if I lose, you could blame the fact that I wasn't from the greatest. It won't look bad on Jewish leadership and scholarship. Now, the name of the fellow who defended us, the people of Israel, that hopefully we will never again have to deal with a lawsuit from the Egyptian government. His name is Gviha ben Psisa. Gviha ben Psisa. The rabbis have different explanations to his name. Gviha ben Psisa. You want to listen into what Gviha responds and how he defended us? He turns to the Egyptians and he says, you want your money back? No problem. But let's do some calculations here. Because the Torah tells us, and it's in the text, that 600,000 people worked for very long in Egypt. The text actually gives a number of how long they were there, 430 years. If so, what we'll do, King Alexander, is we are really willing to return to the Egyptians what they deserve, but we expect our wages for 430 years of 600,000 people. And let's start the calculations. Now, the response worked because the Egyptians never showed up back in court on day 3 when they were supposed to finalize this issue, because they recognized that, you know what? The Jews provided service that is far more valuable than any gold or silver that was taken. Okay, now, Rabbi Meir Simcha asks, wait a second, let's analyze this. Who did the people of Israel take their gold and silver from? Not from the government, but rather from individual Egyptians. Who, on the other hand, were they enslaved to? To the government. So on the surface, the claim remains intact. we took from actual Egyptians. We never worked for actual Egyptians. We worked for the government. So on the surface, their taking of the gold and silver was not fair. So therefore, says Rabbi Meir Simcha, the Torah in verse 23 tells us that Yosef declares that, you know what? You Egyptians and your property are owned by Pharaoh. Hen kaniti etchem hayom vet admatchem leFaro. So therefore, every Egyptian is actually property of the kingdom. And everything he owns, because as you know, when you acquire a slave, you acquire and you have ownership over everything he owns. So therefore, by the Torah telling us that Pharaoh owns all of the Egyptians and all the property in Egypt, therefore the claim that an individual Egyptian would theoretically make against the Jewish people that we took gold and silver from them is irrelevant. Why? Because they own nothing. They were the property of the kingdom. So Rab Meir Simcha gives an insight into verse 23 that all of the Egyptians, every single Egyptians, through the transaction done by Yosef, were owned by Pharaoh, and that defended us in the future from a claim. Okay, a very interesting approach. Now, Dvar Torah number 2 from the Meshech Chochmah. Dvar Torah number 2 of the Meshech Chochmah. And remember, we're supposed to find a contradiction here. Look carefully again, or listen carefully to verse 19 or 20. In verse 19, the Egyptians say, acquire us, please, acquire our land. And in verse 20, Yosef responds by doing what? The Torah tells us. Vayiken Yosef acquired et kol admat Mitzrayim leFaro, all the land of Egypt to Pharaoh. Ki machru Mitzrayim ish sadeu. In other words, verse 20 seems to say quite clearly that although the Egyptians in verse 19 offered themselves, Yosef was not willing to acquire them. He was not. He only acquired their land. And that's what the text tells us. Says the Meshech Chochmah the following. You should know. Yosef did not buy, acquire, own the Egyptians as slaves, because for him, this is something that's unacceptable. A human being owning another human being, very problematic for him. Now, perhaps Yosef, if I would ask Yosef, but wait a second, your great grandfather, Abraham, owned Eliezer. So he would explain that owning someone when there's a spiritual contribution that's made, and Eliezer becomes inspired, and in essence, just as we are servants of God and very proud of it, Eliezer walked around as a servant of Abraham, being very proud that he was a teacher and he could disseminate the teachings of Abraham. That was fine. But to own people as property when there's no spiritual aspect to it, that was problematic, extremely problematic. So therefore, says the Meshech Chochmah in this Dvar Torah, verse 20 tells us that Yosef only acquired the land. And even though in verse 23 we are told kaniti etchem, but if you look carefully, it says kaniti etchem hayom, which means it was a temporary purchase of people to work the land. He hired them, not an acquisition that made them slaves, but rather temporary laborers. Okay, these are the two divrei Torah. And obviously, my father's question is as follows. These two divrei Torah don't match, because in insight number 1, the explanation was that Pharaoh owned all the Egyptians. In explanation number 2, he's saying that nope. To understand verse 20, you have to walk away with clarity that Yosef did not want Pharaoh owning the Egyptians. How do we deal with the contradiction? My father, Olav Shalom, answers. When you study Torah, you have to know that there's pshat and rabbinic insight. And so often when we sit and study the words of Torah, we're going to hear insights that Rashi shares with us, or ones that originate in Midrashim or in the Talmud. And the reader, the educated reader, needs to know this is information that's important. It's part of Torah. The great rabbis and the great commentators, traditional ones, want us to be aware of, but they don't want you to think that it's the simple reading of the text. There's a difference between the two. We have the ability to listen to the words of our Creator and understand that there is more than one explanation. Pshat, the simple explanation, and the rabbinic explanation. So therefore, the two divrei Torah of Rameir Simcha, one is a Pshat Dvar Torah, and one is based on a rabbinic reading. And here we go. The Dvar Torah on verse 23, where he says, the text is telling us Pharaoh owned all the Egyptians. That's Pshat. And it was necessary for that to occur, and it was necessary for the simple reading of the text to indicate that Pharaoh owned all of the Egyptians, and thus all of the property of the Egyptians, because the only way we could defend ourselves one day from the claim of the Egyptians is by having text to show them. You can't argue with the Egyptians in front of Alexander the Great with a rabbinic tradition. Gvia ben Psisa had to show text, and therefore he was able to open this book, show Alexander verse 23, where it's told that Yosef declares, you are owned, every single one of you, by Pharaoh, and that settles the issue. All Egyptians are owned by Pharaoh, all their property belongs to Pharaoh. When the Jews take it, they have every right because they worked for Pharaoh. They got wages from Pharaoh. That is Pshat. And it's important to remember when we interact with the world, and the world has our Bible, you know that if you want to sometimes study Chumash and you are wondering about different translations of Pshat, there are many online. You could get the Vulgate, you could get King James translation, you could get all kind of different translations that don't come from a Jewish source, but they do give you more or less Pshat. They give you the simple reading of the text. And the simple reading of the text seems to belong to humanity as well. And we are given the right to show that text to humanity and claim, you, the Egyptians, have no claim against us. You, the Palestinians, have no claim against us. Just as Ben-Gurion in 1937 to the Peel Commission, when he wanted to present to them and argue that the land of Israel belongs to the Jewish people, he picked up a Tanakh as a contract. Because this is our contract. This is the text that says, and it's simple, and it's a pshat. This is the land given to the people of Israel by God. Period. End of discussion. So therefore, the pshat is something that we use to defend ourselves, because that's what we present to the world. And Gvia ben Psisa worked with pshat, the simple reading of the text. So that takes care of Dvar Torah number one. But then there's a rabbinic reading of the text. And the rabbinic reading is in verse 23, Vayomer Yosef, he tells the Egyptians, Kaniti etchem hayom, I purchased you, but that was temporarily, because I don't want Pharaoh owning people. It is something that's disturbing to me. Your land belongs to Pharaoh, but you guys, you the Egyptians, it's only hayom, temporarily, lizman. And there is strong evidence from verse 20 that that's the case, because after the Egyptians offer themselves and their land, Yosef says, Vayomer, Yosef tells them, yes, I purchased Admat Mitzrayim, only the land. Now comes the question, why was it important for the rabbis and the rabbinic tradition to view Yosef as one that has an issue, a significant issue with Pharaoh owning the Egyptians? So here we have to appreciate the concept of Musar. You've heard the term the Ba'alei Musar. And unfortunately, people sometimes have an approach to this term that the idea of Musar is someone that rebukes you. In other words, when you come to a shul or to yeshiva, and the spiritual guide, the mashgiach, gets up and starts telling you you're doing everything wrong, some believe that that's Musar. Well, that's not Musar. Musar, the real Ba'al Musar, is a person that works on self. And works on self because they understand that the purpose of our existence is self-improvement. And they understand that we have complexities and we have emotions, but if we use those feelings and emotions correctly, we become a better person. And the Baal Musar who works on self understands that since the greatest way of feeling an emotion is experiencing, when I experience something painful, I have a new responsibility of being sure that no one else goes through such pain. Because I understand the power of that pain and the power of that challenge because I experienced it. And if I experienced it, there is no way that I'm going to allow other people to have to go through it. That's the Baal Musar. You use feeling, emotion for self-growth, and you use it to do good for others. Now, what's happening with Reb Meir Simcha is he's telling us that for Yosef, more than anyone else, being owned by someone else, being an Eved, is the worst thing possible. Do you know why? He experienced it. Yosef was a slave, sold, unfortunately, by his brothers. And yes, he reached heights in different areas. He reached heights among the ministers. But the fact is that he was still in recovery mode because he experienced it. Remember, he stands in front of Pharaoh at age 30, but for 13 years, and these are very important years of development, he is suffering as an Eved. He's an Eved. So what happens when he is offered an opportunity by the Egyptians that now they become avadim leparo? And here comes Yosef. Yosef, who believes in a strong government because he feels it's the best thing that Egypt needs at this point, right? In general, by the way, Judaism respects the idea of people having an attachment to their land. And therefore, in Eretz Yisrael, when things are operating the way they should, people return after the 50-year cycle and the Jubilee, the Yovel, they return to their ancestral land. Because attachment to land is good when the vibes of the land are positive. Eretz Yisrael has something that when you work the land, it connects you to God. And you see it. You see it. You interact with farmers. Now it's Shemitah year. So it's their year of recharging. But the goal of the Shemitah is that when they return, they understand that this is a land that was given to us by God. And when you go ahead and harvest the peppers in southern Israel or the tomatoes or whatever you are working, you feel a connection because Eretz Yisrael connects you to God. So in Israel, a connection to your ancestral land is tremendous. That doesn't exist in Egypt. In Egypt, there's a danger. You feel connected to land. You feel very confident in your existence. You feel that you can enjoy the world. And if you are focused on personal pleasure, you're not going to be that righteous person concerned about the welfare of others. In Egypt, in a corrupt Egypt, there was a concern for Yosef that people have that deep connection. And therefore, he felt that the best thing possible for them at that time was to weaken, in essence, the population, strengthen the righteous government, and get them back on a path of justice and righteousness. That is true for their land, not for the individuals. For Yosef, to go ahead and be part, right, of this plan of having Egyptians being owned by Pharaoh, creating a society of avadim, unacceptable for him, because he went through it. And the Meshech Chachma tells us that Yosef sana me'od et kinyana avdut. He hated it. It was sickening to him. unacceptable. So therefore, although according to Pshat it occurred, and it was necessary for the text to communicate that according to Pshat, yes, Yosef was part of this master plan of having all Egyptians owned by Pharaoh. And it was needed because this document called Torah is one day going to defend the people of Israel from the challenge of the Egyptians. But the rabbinic tradition, do you know what rabbinic tradition is about? Do you know what the Torah Sheba'al Peh is about? It's about sensitivity. It's about Musar. That we look at this text and we say, you know what? This is a text that is here to guide us how to become better. And I'm going to be involved in analyzing the oral tradition because it will deepen my commitment to the text and to the giver of the text, and a commitment to what he wants from us, to develop sensitivity. That if I went through an experience, I want to turn around and make a difference for others, that they shouldn't have to suffer like I did. I'm going to use my past to assist others. That's the Yosef, the oral tradition wants us to walk away with. And that's the other Dvar Torah of the Meshech Chochmah. One Dvar Torah, my father explained, is a Pshat Dvar Torah. Very significant, very important. The other Dvar Torah is a Torah Sheba'al Peh, the oral tradition. What's the oral tradition? Judaism is about sensitivity. It's about concern. You know, when you look at the great Balei Musar, the first half of the 20th century, what they focus on a lot is what's known as Noseh Be'olim Chavero, carrying a yoke with your fellow Jew. When you see someone suffering and carrying a yoke, right, you go ahead and say, you know what, I have this responsibility to do so as well. I can't be, God forbid, ever entertained. It's a problem that exists today, that people, we have access to a lot of entertainment on the screens, on TVs, and on the internet. And people could go ahead and watch a show of Oprah interviewing Meghan, and Harry about their issues they have with family. And you imagine the pain. For some reason, I always imagine the pain of what Harry went through. A little boy that loses his mother, and the whole world, billions of people watching. And now he suddenly has, again, a struggle with the wife for whatever reason. So it's painful. But what is the world doing? What is the world doing? The world is watching it on a big screen, eating popcorn. In other words, sitting and eating popcorn. Oh, he's suffering. Oh my goodness, that's so terrible. Okay, I can't refill, right? That is very far from the Jewish approach, very far from what the Torah and especially the oral tradition, Torah Sheba'al Peh, wants us to be all about. It's about growth. It's about sensitivity. He's suffering. He's suffering. Think about his pain. Think about what he experienced. Okay, all the money in the world and the publicity and fame cannot take care of a pain of a person that he has to go through it again to some extent with family. Noseh be'ol im chavero, to carry that burden with your fellow Jew, and with fellow human being as well. And that's what the Meshech Chochmah wants us to see in Yosef's activities. Because if you read carefully, verse 19 to verse 20, there is a shift there. The Egyptians offer themselves, and Yosef says, according to Chazal, no, I can't own you. We can't have that. We can't have that. So it's an insight, I think, that's important because it gives us an idea how we view Torah Shebachsav, and the idea that we share with humanity, the simple reading of the text, we present it to humanity. And at the same time, let's remember what the core of Judaism is about. The core is the concern, and this is what Yosef does for us. And yes, it's tragic that the Egyptians were not appreciative. They were not appreciated. And when you start reading in Parashat Shmos, that the leadership of Egypt and Pharaoh forgets about Yosef's contribution, you say to yourself, this is a corrupt society. This is a corrupt society. They are lacking appreciation for what Yosef did. He saved the country. He put everything for the country. Do you know that commentators note that you don't find throughout Tanakh anyone that was a ruler for 8 decades, for 80 years? Where do you find that? A ruler for 80 years. It'll be interesting in world history where you have that, right? What Victoria, from what was she from? I think 1837 to 1901, something like, she didn't get her 80 years, okay? Yosef is a ruler for 80 years, from age 30 to 110. And he's a devoted ruler. Day in, day out, was not focused on the comforts that he could have lived with, but rather the welfare of a society. Yosef was focused only on that. And what happens? No one knows about him. Why? They clear the textbooks, like textbooks in some areas that they want to remove the state of Israel. It doesn't exist. And you know very well that in a society that's completely controlled, a totalitarian society, you could adjust the education that within a decade, people don't know about things anymore. Education is very important. The Egyptians were lacking hakarat tov. And if we, the Jewish people, were taken out of Egypt, and there's an expectation that the Egypt is taken out of us, what we have to learn from it is our essence should be lehodot, to be appreciative. When people do for you things, be appreciative. And that's the Yehudi. And when God Almighty does good, and he does a lot of good, we should be appreciative. That's our essence, because we were taken out of Egypt. We were taken out of that culture, that environment, and that attitude, that kommt mir, in Yiddish, I deserve it. I deserve it. I'm not going to be appreciative for dinner. I deserve dinner, right? The Jew needs to take Egypt out of himself because God took us out of Egypt. And that's our essence. And despite that, Yosef is an inspiration. Maybe the Egyptians forgot, but throughout the ages, the Bible, the Tanakh that was given to us, and it was translated, and the world is aware of it, they are inspired by the righteousness of Yosef. And throughout history, we've had people that have made contributions to the Jewish people and contributions to the world with the values of Yosef, that I'm going to remain committed and do good for others and sanctify the name of God by doing it, because I understand that this is the will of the Creator, and that's his essence. So these are a few lessons from Parashat Vayigash. Hopefully we are going to celebrate the unity. Hopefully we're going to understand the idea that when we do good for the world in a way that sanctifies the name of God, we are doing good for Klal Yisrael. And hopefully we understand the difference between Pshat and a rabbinic reading and the tremendous contribution that each one of them actually